We are live. It is, well, not quite. It is 6 p.m. now Eastern time, 5 o'clock Central. Welcome, everyone, for our preseason kickoff show for the D3 Division III women's basketball season. I'm joined by Riley again, and we're going to go through all kinds of topics. So let's hit our agenda right off the bat. We're going to talk about some off-season news, try to get you up to speed if you've missed anything. We are going to talk about NPI, probably the biggest change of the offseason, biggest piece of news. We will talk about plans for the season for Riley and myself. And then we will talk about teams to watch. And we've got, at the moment, 2 listener questions. Starting with off-season news. You want to take this one, Riley?
Yeah, for sure, Scott. I mean, obviously we kind of, coming off a season that was incredible last year. A lot of teams rose to the forefront. We saw a lot of great matchups. And obviously, kind of the headline of last season was NYU and the way that they really handled that, because they played in a very tough UAA. We knew Emory and WashU were both going to be really good. And NYU just kind of dominated throughout that schedule. Now, they were challenged at points, but they were really, really impressive in terms of the depth that they had, the ability to make the run. Obviously, they go undefeated and win the national title. So a big year for them. But a lot of the question, obviously, Morgan Morrison graduated. She was a transfer from Smith that came in for them last year, as did Megan Bauman and Erica Miller. All 3 graduated. So they got 2 stars returning for this coming season. But 2 very incredible All-American type players in Natalie Bruns and Belle Palikia. Both were Bruns started all 31 games. Palikia started, 30 of 31. And I think these are just, incredible players that come back for them, 2 of the 3 stars. But then Caroline Pepper, a player that came off the bench for them a bunch last year, averaged 19.8 minutes a game. She's going to give them some really quality minutes, more than likely stepping in that starting lineup. But then you have 2 D1 transfers, that come in and players that, have played at the Division I level. They weren't just on the roster. They saw minutes in Kate Peak and Jamie Bihar, from Fairfield and Lehigh, respectively. So NYU, in terms of their ability to reload, both through the transfer portal and through players that got minutes coming off the bench last year, they look really, really good and poised for another big year. I know they'll be my number 1 team in the preseason. I'm sure they will be for a lot of voters, not only based on last season, but based on who they bring back and just the talent level that we know that they have as far as their starting 5 and then onto their bench as well.
Yeah, I imagine that they will be highly ranked to begin the year once again. We also had a lot of coaching changes. I don't know if it was quite to the level of Division I college football, where I believe, was it 3 of the final 4 teams in the college football championship had their head coaches leave, but we had some really strong programs, wonderful coaches move. So you want to take this one also?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, because, when we looked at it, a lot of teams, there were several teams that were in notable leagues, and multiple teams that made the NCAA tournament last year saw coaching changes in the offseason. Several of those head coaches moving up to the Division I level, just like in the case of Transylvania. Julie Folks, who had been at Transylvania 10 years, obviously led them to the national title in Dallas in 2023. Got the opportunity at D1 Marshall to become a head coach. That's a huge jump. Certainly wish her the best of luck there. Hannah Varell, who was a longtime assistant at Transy, is now the head coach there. And then when you move on to Trinity, Connecticut, another D3 coach making the jump to D1, Emily Garner, moving up to Cornell. Maria Williamson comes from Chicago. That created a vacancy at Chicago, a pretty notable UAA program. St. John Fisher, another team, a team that had won 3 straight Empire 8 tournament titles. Melissa Kuberka heads across town to RIT, and she's going to look to kind of rebuild that program. Sarah Cartmill is now the head coach there, comes from Fredonia State. Milliken is another NCAA tournament team. A lot of people obviously saw the success that they had. Olivia Lett, head coach there, recruited Elise Knudsen, amongst others, to that program. She's now at Illinois Springfield, the D2 level. Kirsten Hammer comes over from UW Whitewater, where she was an assistant for a long time. So great head coaching opportunity for her. And then Wash U, Randy Henderson. This was a pretty big announcement as well. Moves up to the staff at D1 Iowa. Obviously, everyone knows how good Iowa's been in recent years. A tremendous opportunity for her. She's an alum of that Iowa program. Leaves a vacancy at Wash U, but then Lisa Stone comes in, who has been a D1 head coach, was a head coach at UW Eau Claire. Tons of experience at both the D3 and D1 levels. Great hire for Wash U and Lisa Stone. I think that's an A+ hire right there. And Wash U's program could very well be a top 10 team, and they have a great coach leading them into that. And then Washington Lee, who made the big tournament run last year, Christine Clancy, actually resigned. Brittany Kemp was named the head coach, comes over from St. Mary's of Maryland. She has a lot of D3 experience. And so Washington Lee should be in good hands. I think the last one on this list of tournament teams from last year is Marietta, with Cole Vivian taking the job at Edgewood, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And then Jenna Anderson, who was an assistant there for several years, was promoted to head coach. So a lot of movement amongst NCAA tournament teams, it feels like, as compared to years past. And it'll be interesting to follow some of these teams heading into this season with new coaching staffs and some new leaders at the helms of those programs. And then just a couple others, Scott, that I think we thought were pretty notable. Carnegie Mellon hires Kathy McConnell Miller, a head coach who, coached at a bunch of places in the past, coached in the WNBA for a little while on a staff there as an assistant, was also head coach at the University of Colorado, has a ton of experience in terms of building programs. She was most recently a high school coach in that Pittsburgh area. So really looking forward to seeing what she can do. She has a good roster coming back this year. Edgewood obviously hiring Cole Vivian because of the departure of Chaya Huff to Marquette. She's going to become an assistant there. So another D3 to D1 jump. And we've seen that a couple of times this year. Del Val, Laura Hogan retired after 28 seasons. And longtime head coach retiring there. Same thing as we saw at WestCon, another longtime coach retiring. So we've certainly seen a lot of coaching changes over the course of this offseason. And the list is pretty long, Scott, as you talked about. A lot of great coaches retiring, leaving for other opportunities. But it'll be interesting because there are a lot of great first-time head coaches who've been part of big-time staffs in terms of the D3 powers within the last couple of years, who are now getting their own programs, their own head coaching opportunities, and it'll be cool to see kind of where they take their new programs into this next season.
Definitely. Another big piece of offseason news was NPI. We are not going to talk about it at this moment. It gets its own agenda item. School changes, so kind of some logistical changes around. So SUNY Canton was strong last year, and also Morrisville State going from the NAC to the SUNYAC. Hopefully I do not pronounce one of these abbreviated conference names in a way that is that's a faux pas. But those are two teams moving conferences. SUNY Geneseo and Rockport State left the SUNYAC for the Empire 8. And then SUNY Poly is the same as SUNY IT, right? That's the Polytechnic Institute. Yep. They're also going to join the Empire 8. So a lot of movement right there between. Did the NAC not backfill any of those three? So they just went down by 3 in size?
Yeah, there's a couple of changes. I'll double check on that, Scott, as you kind of go through the rest. But yeah, there was a few. I think that conference had expanded pretty large, and a couple of schools were moving for geography purposes.
And then we've got some changes down south. So Concordia in Texas, University of the Ozarks, and McMurray are all going from the ASC to the SCAC, making the ASC ever smaller, as they might be part of off-season news next year. And And then, unfortunately, we had some closed institutions. Birmingham Southern, Wells, Clark Summit, and Eastern Nazarene were the 4 that closed in this offseason. And then a couple programs left Division III. So Defiance left, and University of Texas, Dallas also left. And I didn't put a slide here, but Mary Baldwin is still a D3 school, but they will not be fielding a women's basketball team this year. And as far as I know, Carleton women's basketball is fielding a team this year after having just too small of a roster to safely compete last year. And so not competing last year. So we do have Carleton back. And my count is at exactly 420 women's basketball competing schools this year. So our next bit of news, transfers, we're going to first talk about interdivision transfers. So players that were D3 players and still are D3 players. Riley and I were talking recently. We don't know if there's more of these transfers this offseason or if we've just been tracking them closer. There's definitely going to, I would imagine there's going to be more this year than there will be in future years because the COVID 5th year is going away.
Right. Yeah, this is the last year of that. Yep.
But one of the big ones, so Jordan Carpenter transferred from Mary Washington to Penn State Harrisburg and should just be an absolute force for Harrisburg and in that league. Sydney Sherman also, Sydney Sherman, I believe, was a grad transfer.
Correct. Yep.
But Jordan Carpenter was a junior last year. And I also never really know what people's status is and whether schools are choosing to list their academic class versus their athletic eligibility class. Those can often be different, right? In Division III.
Yeah.
And so it's not uncommon for someone to be listed as a junior on a roster and then graduate. Because they probably had athletic eligibility, but we're graduating.
Right. And that's kind of the thing that we're trying to track. It's a little tough to figure out the eligibility with a lot of these transfers, how many years they have left. Some players are coming with 2 years. Some just have 1 left. So that's definitely something to track. I believe Carpenter is also a grad transfer. She was a senior listed on the roster last year. So both are grad transfers. Obviously, that makes sense. As we talked about in years past in these live streams, there are some schools that don't necessarily have expansive grad programs. And as a result, they tend to sometimes lose a few more of these players that want to use that 5th year, to other D3 schools like we're seeing here at Mary Washington.
But Sydney Sherman will be a great post presence for Christopher Newport. That I can't remember one of their post players that they graduated, but they've graduated some really good post players over the last couple of years, and it will be nice to get a grad transfer of a quality of Sydney Sherman. Jolene Lusk transferred from St. John Fisher to Cortland. It's not the type of transfer you see all too well. I mean, I guess a head coaching change is a reason, but Lusk was a freshman transferring. So I guess, a head coaching change is a very common reason for a transfer. But it is not often that you see underclassmen, especially freshmen, moving. Hannah Malik was a grad transfer from Washington and Lee to Emory. I've got her name spelled wrong there. Sorry, Hannah, no H at the end of your name.
That is my bad.
That's going to be a really nice addition for Emory, who is Emory. They're losing Claire Brock, right?
Correct.
And so it's really nice to be able to, as much as you can, replace Claire Brock with a really experienced and solid guard. And then Tony Thompson. To me, these are the top 5 transfers from D3 to D3. Tony Thompson transferred from Occidental to Babson, so probably traveling the furthest of any of these transfers. But that'll be a big addition for Babson, who, I mean, I think they took a step backwards last year, but I think it was largely due to just graduating so much talent. And while it was more of a rebuild, and they also had a new coach, but I think Tony Thompson will raise the talent level significantly for a Babson team that was much stronger in the second half of last year than they were in the first. Allie Landau transfer from Haverford to Smith. Smith graduated a handful of very, very good players. I think they definitely pushed NYU the furthest of any team last year. Madison Naru, I'm going to take a guess
believe.
there.
Yeah.
Roanoke to Chatham. So Chatham pulled in like 12 transfers between D3 and from out of D3. And Madison Naru is one of those. Another one is Maria Barella, transferring from Maine Maritime to Chatham. And then Adriana McCoy transferred from Hartford to Southwestern. Any comments, Riley, before we move on?
Yeah, I think Scott did a good job of covering that list. I think there's a lot of impactful transfers, even a lot more than are just on this list. As you mentioned, Chatham brought in a lot of transfers, a lot of quality transfers, and players that could see a very, very big impact, players that were impactful at other schools. So we have a lot of these schools that are bringing in several transfers this season. But I think you're right. This is kind of the core. These are the players that you probably want to be paying attention to as far as making the biggest impacts at their new programs.
So then we'll highlight 4 transfers that are entering Division III from a non-Division III level. We already talked about Kate Peak and Jamie Bihar moving from Division I institutions where they played good minutes and transferring to NYU. Mackenzie Carter also coming from Division I Tulane into Emory. So Emory, well, you can kind of see a theme in the first 3 on this list. I think the UAA is always going to be a really desired spot for grad transfers from another division. So even when we don't have a COVID year, you could absolutely see grad transfers who still have a year of academic eligibility transferring to a strong institution like all of the ones in the UAA to play another year of athletics. And then Alex Rondorf transferring from Division II Michigan Tech to Wisconsin Oshkosh. I think those are the 4 main ones, but it is often hard to get really good information on those transfers coming into Division III. So, hopefully we're pleasantly surprised by others that we missed.
Right. And there very well might be some more of those. Not every roster is out yet either. So there may be some out there that we just haven't gotten word about yet that we will find out about pretty soon once the season starts.
And then 2 pieces of very miscellaneous news. The CCS as a conference now has a Pool A. So they're past, I don't know what the term is, their preliminary period. So they have a Pool A. And because of that, there will be no Pool B this year. So there are not enough teams to, I believe, meet the access ratio, which means that there is no need for a Pool B bid. So there will be 21 Pool Cs, which is 43 Pool A's.
Yep.
And I'm about 90% sure. All right. So that handles our off-season news. But the biggest piece of news was really NPI. So let's get into it. So the first place you really want to go to learn about NPI is D3 Datacast on YouTube. They have the best primer. They've got all the examples to run through, and really that's the place to set your base of knowledge for NPI. And this is actually perfect. I was struggling in the moment to remember what that acronym stood for. So there it is, the NCAA Power Index. That's NPI. That's your first stop to educating yourself. But as part of NPI, I am going to go through this quicker, since the purpose of this isn't to not teach it just as deep as the D3 Datacast did. But the Women's Basketball Committee got the opportunity to set some dials. So I'll talk through a few of these. The win percentage in SOS dial is a percentage. So it kind of, or it's not really a percentage, kind of is a percentage, but it needs to sum to 1 or 100%. And they selected 20 for win percentage and 80 for strength of schedule. One thing to think about here, this does not mean that they are saying that strength of schedule is 4 times as important as win percentage, because the distribution of winning percentages really go from 0. There are usually winless teams every year to 1,000. There are undefeated teams every year, whereas the strength of schedules really kind of stay between 450 and 550, roughly speaking. And so placing those weights does not mean that strength of schedule is 4 times as important as winning percentage. And I think that the ratio that was selected by the Women's Basketball Committee is extremely, extremely reasonable and kind of fits how we've seen those two pieces of criteria relatively valued in past years. And I think it's going to really identify strong teams and teams that beat other good teams. So I think that was a great selection there. The QWB is a quality win bonus. Basically, if you beat a team above a certain threshold, which is going to be a team that has an NPI of 54 or greater, I think that is going to be about team 170 or 160. But if you beat a team above that number, you get a little bonus. Now, the nice thing about the bonus is it's a different amount based on how good of a team you beat. So if you beat team 1, you get a bigger bonus than if you beat team 150. It's all extremely reasonable. I think you could have set the quality win bonus lower or higher, and it really wouldn't have had a ton of difference. That quality win bonus multiplier is fairly important. It basically means once we know the bonus, how much do we want it to affect your overall NPI? And they picked 2/3. They could have picked something lower or higher. I haven't really thought about the implications of selecting something lower or higher. But basically, you can't roll out of bed, beat the 10th best team, and have it made to the NCAA tournament. Like the quality win bonus is not that high, even for beating an elite team. You have to build a strong resume throughout your entire schedule. Jumping back a bit, the home away win loss, there are no weightings for home or away games. I know that some have wanted there to be more weighting for a road win and more weighting for a home loss. But the women's basketball committee decided to keep those exactly even. So there's no difference in those sorts of results. Likewise, there's no overtime adjustment. Sometimes I believe if there's an adjustment there, you might get more credit if you're the losing team, but it was an overtime game, to acknowledge that the game was very close. In fact, died at the end of regulation. And then the minimum wins threshold is really, really interesting. I was going to say it's basically, but really what I want to do is completely define it. It will be the case for a top team trying to get into the NCAA tournament that they will beat a very weak team, and the credit they get for beating a really weak team would be so low that it would actually lower their overall MPI. Now, if that team has at least 15 wins with a greater NPI score, they don't have to count the win that would have lowered their overall NPI. And I think that this concept is great. So if you look at teams from conferences that are somewhat large and often have a fairly weak bottom few teams, I think of the SCAC or the SLIAC or the MIAA or the President's Athletic Conference, the Landmark as well, with the addition of 2 more schools. It's really tough for the top teams in those conferences to have to play 2 teams or 2 conference games against multiple teams that will drag down their strength of schedule, but in the present would drag down their overall NPI. Well, the minimum wins threshold is a way to say, hey, if we can see that you have a body of work large enough, we won't force those wins of yours to bring down your overall NPI. And that minimum wins threshold was set at 15. It could have been set at 5, which would have been probably too generous. And it could have been set at 20 or 22, which would have resulted in it really not being used very much. And so I think 15 is again a really reasonable spot to set it. Based on my knowledge of the numbers, I think the 20-80 ratio is like spot on, perfect. For the minimum wins threshold, I haven't thought about it very much to know like, oh, I would have rather seen it be 12 or 17. I really don't know. But it also, on the face of it, seems very reasonable, where you're not going to be dropping too many games and you're not going to be forced to count too many games that you don't want to.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it. The minimum wins thing, you described that way better than I would have. Uh, because yeah, I think it is a interesting thing. I think a lot of people, have looked at this and seen the minimum wins. I know some people early on thought that was the minimum number of wins you had to have to count an MPI. That's not the case at all. You described it really well there. I think it's going to help out a lot of those teams that tend to be very good, but coming from weak conferences. And a lot of these conferences are playing double round robin schedules. That's pretty standard. But to alleviate some of the impact of playing those bottom teams, where you could have a team that goes 3-22 overall in your conference that you have to play twice, it definitely does help those top teams. And I think overall, this is a very, very good balance. I think it's a very good system. Admittedly, I had my doubts early on when MPI was adopted, but having now seen exactly what it looks like and how it's going to be, utilized, I think it's going to be a great thing to really allow us to get the best teams into the tournament, properly evaluate these teams, and really be able to take each resume, regardless of where a team's from, conference-wise, geography-wise, and really put them against everyone else nationally, and have a way to do that. In past, and this may still be the case to some degree, but teams are really benefiting in certain parts of the country because they could have more regionally ranked wins. They have more of those opportunities. That kind of thing is going away with MPI. It's creating a more balanced system and structure, and I think that's going to be a good thing for Division III as a whole.
Yep. Yeah. So some key differences from the system that we have left behind. There are no more regional rankings. There might be a published regional ranking, but it will really just be the NPI of the teams within that region. There is no such thing as results versus regionally ranked opponents. So there's no 7 ranked teams per region, no threshold of what is an RO and what isn't. All of that, at least to our complete knowledge, is completely out the window, which is great because if you beat team that's number 65 in the nation that happens to be ranked, and another team beats team 75 in the nation that happens to not be ranked, the amount of credit in the old system was very different that you got. Whereas in this system, it just says, hey, you beat the number 65 team, we'll give you an amount of game NPI value commensurate with the NPI rank or score of the team that you beat. And so, team 60 will get you a little bit more than beating team 61 and a little bit more than beating team 62, which it's more of a linear treatment of beating teams rather than these really stark thresholds based on whether this team was ranked or not, or whether they were a region number 2 versus a region number 3, things like that. We believe that there will be no surprises on Selection Sunday. So whatever the NPI is at the end of the conference tournaments, the committee will select the top 21 teams for Pool C bids that don't already have a Pool A. And we'll know that as soon as games are done. And there's no subjectivity. Now, I know that subjectivity among committees can be bad. I think that in basketball, both the men's committee and the women's committee, we were very spoiled in that the subjectivity was used both consistently and with really good goals in mind. And I saw lots of cohesiveness through the racks and the national committees, and really very few surprises. So I don't think Division III basketball has tons to gain by that amount of subjectivity going away. There might be other sports that have more to gain from that. But at the end of the day, it is nice to say, like, hey, it's an objective system. There's absolutely no opportunity for anyone to do some amount of lobbying to change any, so that's all out the window. Any comments from you, Riley, before we hit another slide with 4 more bullets about MPI?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it well there. I mean, yeah, the part as far as the selection announcement, they're really, I mean, we're going to know what the field looks like once those conference tournaments wrap up. I think last conference tournaments wrap up Sunday afternoon. So we'll know how that all looks and what teams are in. Now, obviously, the bracketing aspect of that, we won't know where everyone's going because geography still plays into all this, but we will know who's in the tournament. And that'll certainly be a big difference compared to years past.
Absolutely. So some more key differences. As I've already alluded to, strong versus weak regions don't matter. Whereas previously, we knew that the number 7th ranked team in each region were not all equal. And so if you happened to be in a weaker region, you might have had more opportunity to get ranked wins against teams that were worse than ranked wins from against teams in other regions. That doesn't matter anymore, like at all, because NPI, there's no stipulation from a region for a certain number of teams to be ranked in the NPI higher than, I'm using too many words, but basically region has no impact on your NPI. There's no aggregate win percentage in strength of schedule. So before, your win percentage was looked at as a whole for the year, and your strength of schedule was looked at as a whole for the year. And when you really dig into it, you'd rather know, did I actually beat the strongest teams that I faced, or did I lose to them?
Right.
Rather than just having an aggregate win percentage and aggregate strength of schedule. And NPI will give you a score for the game based on if you win or lose it and the strength of your opponent. It ties them together, which is, to me, perfect. Because in the previous system, you could say, hey, I think I'm going to win a bunch of my games, but my strength of schedule is going to be low. So why don't I just book NYU? I'll probably lose the game, but it will jump my strength of schedule by 10 points, which is going to be great come Selection Sunday. Well, we don't want that.
Right.
Whereas in this system, everyone booking, just about basically anyone who it would matter for booking. Well, actually, we'll get to this. But if you book NYU knowing that you're going to lose and you lose, it's going to decrease your NPI. It's either going to decrease it or not change it. And so you don't have any sort of automatic gains from a loss, which to me, again, is perfect. We're pairing together. You don't get automatic gains from any sort of loss. And there are going to be some wins that you don't get automatic decreases from as well because of that minimum wins threshold. And so it's just great. Whereas I hated to see teams who you knew were very strong, but with every conference game that they played over their last 8 games, you could just see their SOS go down, 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 down. And you knew that they weren't going to get a pool C, even if they were probably one of the best 40 basketball teams in the nation. And I think NPI will do a better job at letting those sorts of teams come to the forefront. There are still, if you're in region 10 and it's just hard for you to find 25 D3 games and you can only book 21, yeah, you're going to be at a disadvantage, right, to schools that can play 25 Division 3 games. But the amount that you're at a disadvantage is a lot smaller than in the previous system where, if you're Santa Cruz, either you have a giant travel budget or you just can't get ROs unless people travel to you. And that kind of thing is way less of a deal now. Whereas as long as USC Santa Cruz can get 18, 19, 20, 21 Division 3 games, as long as those games aren't against the worst 100 teams in Division 3, if they win 80% of them, they'll make the tournament.
Right.
Whereas in the previous system, they could win 80% of them and not make the tournament because they might be 0-0 or 0-1 versus region ranked opponents.
Yeah. I'll just say too, as someone in Region 10, obviously I talked to a lot of Region 10 coaches. That's a big deal. It's tough to get games when you're in Texas, when you're on the West Coast, and Colorado College as well, thrown in this. And so for them to obviously, again, you're right, there's going to still be some sort of disadvantage, but it's going to be a lot less than what it's been in past years. And that's a really good sign for a lot of these good programs out in these Region 10 conferences who have tried over the years, but just don't have the ability to go out always and get a ton of regionally ranked opponents. That was the big drawback for a lot of these programs in past years. And with regionally ranked results going away, it definitely gives them a better chance to make the tournament and be in contention for Pool C bids.
Another dynamic that's gone is if I schedule a team in my region, think Mary Hardin Baylor and Hardin Simmons scheduling themselves. Wait, are they in the same conference, Riley?
They are in the same conference, yeah.
Or like, I mean, I don't know if Trinity would schedule Hardin Simmons.
Right.
So different
That's a good
conferences.
example. Yeah.
Well, whoever won that game was almost assuredly going to be ranked ahead in the region because of the head-to-head. And you kind of push the other team down in your own region where there's only 7 spots to be ranked. Now, both those teams were usually ranked near the top, but if you had 2 teams closer to number 7, there was kind of an incentive to not schedule each other because if you lost, you could be automatically out of the rankings. Whereas now, there's no automatically in or out of regional rankings. It's just that if you take a loss, your overall NPI will drop somewhat. But there's less of these kind of almost big red lights saying like, hey, if you lose this game, you're going to be ranked behind them for the rest of the year. And so I think that that's also a really nice dynamic where you can be in the same region and I think willingly schedule teams from your region.
Yeah, true. This will affect scheduling a lot, and I think that'll be interesting to follow over the next couple of years.
We already talked about no reward for scheduling a top team if you lose. Teams who play in conferences that are weak at the bottom, I think, are helped. And when I say helped, I don't mean they now have an advantage. I think before they had a disadvantage that was hiding how good they were as a program, and now that has less of an ability to be hidden. So it's almost like a disadvantage is being removed. It's not like an advantage has been granted. And then we already hit on this. So the strength of your opponent is tied to the result. And that's great. We want to know, like, did you beat good teams? Which is part of the reason that we had RROs, because there was an acknowledgement that winning percentage and aggregate SOS were extremely limited. So why don't we create this thing called RROs to count the number of good teams that you beat? But it, of course, had its problems. But I think the desire was the same. MPI just does it in a linear, objective, formulaic manner. So we're going to hit a small example. I'm kind of springing this on Riley. One schedule I think is really interesting is Vassar's. I'm hoping this is Vassar's. And so what I've got here is I've got 25 regular season games plus 2 hypothetical Liberty tournament games, because I think they do 6 teams in the tournament. I would imagine Vassar is one of the top 2 seeds, gets a bye. And then they do play a tournament, and I just penciled in Ursinus and Vassar as each winning their Friday games, so they would play Saturday. But those 3 games in color might not be opponents. I also have my projected preseason rank for the teams, and for the purposes of this example, I pulled what was the NPI last year of whatever team was first ranked. Now, I don't think that my preseason rankings are going to map exactly to NPI. So you're going to have to kind of take this with a grain of salt. Well, I've currently set this up where Vassar wins every game. If we counted every game, they would have an NPI of 62.45, which would have been 15th overall. But if you'll remember, there's the minimum wins threshold. So if we look down here, we can see here's 15 wins. Let's not count anything below that because they're going to all of these game NPI values are below 62.45. So then they would have an NPI of 66.76 and be ranked 3rd. So that's what an undefeated season looks like. But let's say, hey, they're not going to go undefeated. So if they lose to Johns Hopkins, probably the most likely team for them to lose to, they don't get 100 for the win. They get 0. Additionally, a loss will always count unless it raises their MPI. In this case, it is not going to raise their MPI. But the minimum wins threshold is still 15. This is a loss, so it doesn't count as a win. So they have to count whatever would be their lowest game NPI to get back up to that 15 wins threshold. So you can see if they lose to Johns Hopkins, it drops their NPI a little bit and drops them down by a rank. We can do this a couple more times. So I gave them 3 more losses, which means they need to count 3 more wins, I believe.
Yep.
I did one too many. So they're 22nd. So they're starting, that's kind of around the range of falling out of a pool C. Not quite there yet. But if instead of losing to, say, Trinity, they lost to Bard. So we still need gain MPI. We still need 15. So we don't need to count that one. They do count. They have to count this Bard game now. So I guess that didn't drop them down a ton. But you can kind of play with this mentally and see where it's going to fall for a team like Vassar. I think kind of right there. So the more top, if you beat a very top team, it gives you a little bit of buffer. If you lose to a very bad team, it takes away a lot of buffer quickly.
Yep.
And if you take care of business, if even teams making the NCAA tournament do not win 100% of their games versus teams in the 75 to 200 range. They do not win 100% of those games. But if you go take care of business, you give yourself buffer again. Yep. But this is kind of the exercise where you win or lose the game. So you either get 20 points or 0 from the result. The strength of schedule is always built in. So that's your opponent's NPI times 0.8. So that was kind of that 80 part of the ratio. You get a quality win bonus if their NPI is above 54. And it all sums to a game NPI. I'm trying to are there any other things that you would think are useful to mention as people kind of feel out what is this NPI thing and how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great example there. I'm glad you brought up the situation where if Bard were to upset Vassar, because I think, again, all losses are going to count. Obviously, as you said, with the caveat being unless they help your MPI, that's really not going to happen. So I think what you really quickly realize and what coaches need to realize as they schedule and just fans and people who are following this is that, there is a situation where, losing a game to a bottom tier team in your conference can really, really hurt your MPI really quickly. And you rack up 1 or 2 of those. And that could be the difference between you making the tournament and not making it, regardless of even how strong your non-conference is. So I think it places a lot of importance. This is very similar to past years in terms of, playing well in non-conference, but it also places a lot of emphasis in conference play because just because you're playing a weaker team in your league, you take a loss and this is a big impact to your MPI. So I think it's just a great example for people to see how it's going to look with an actual schedule there in the hypothetical scenario of a couple of different things happening. But I think you covered it well looking at, what would happen losing to some of the top teams, what would happen if you go undefeated. And I think you can see, how a couple of results can really quickly change the MPI number of a team going from all the way from 3 down to 22 with just a couple of different results in there.
And so I'll touch on this later, but I have a lot less work to do because projecting winning percentage is not useful anymore. In past years, I could have looked at this schedule for Vassar and been like, I think they're going to win about 82% of their games. And I could be probably pretty close because that prediction, it didn't matter if they beat Trinity and lost to Union once or swept Union but lost to Trinity. It was an aggregate. Well, for NPI, aggregate winning percentage doesn't matter. You need to predict each of these results. And I have no ability to do that with any sort of accuracy, right?
Yep.
And so there's just no need to project overall winning percentage. But as teams go through the year, I will be trying to highlight games on their schedule that have a lot of leverage. So for a team like Vassar, let's say, a lot of their tough games are some of their tough games are non-conference. Let's say they start off, they lose all 4 of those games, and maybe they also lose to Mount St. Mary and Ursinus. Well, then I'll start highlighting how few conference games they can lose. And show like, oh, these games versus Skidmore are extra important. Or on the flip side, let's say Vassar goes out and, goes undefeated in non-conference against some really good opponents. Then we start having a different conversation, right? I can say, oh, their games against Skidmore are still really important, but they're really important if they want to host an NCAA tournament first and second round. So the conversation kind of changes, and we just have less of an ability to project overall winning percentage. So I think in a lot of ways it'll be more fun. Whereas last year you could get halfway through the year and see a team, oh, they can't come back from this winning percentage or this low strength of schedule. They have to win a Pool A or they're out. Whereas for this year, for teams in the top 125, maybe you do have to, win all 8 of your remaining games against the best teams, but you still have a path to it that doesn't involve running the table in your conference championship. So I think that's really fun. We had a couple questions. One is, at what point of the season will the first ranking come out? So we don't know what the NCAA's plan is for calculating, like how often they're going to calculate MPI and when and where they're going to publish it. I do believe I just heard from Dave McHugh that the NCAA either published or is about to publish the first NPI rankings for the football season. And I think he indicated that it kind of coincided with the time in the year that the first week of regional rankings would come out in each sport. So it could be that the NCAA is not planning on posting NPI until around the time that they would have published the first regional rankings. And you can see, like, for the first game of the season, the NPIs are not going to be very useful, like after everyone's played one game. And so there might be a desire to not see NYU win a game and be 194th, and then win another game and be second, and then win another game, but then drop to 30th. Because those sorts of fluctuations can absolutely happen early in the year. Now, since I believe week 1 of the football season, d3datacast.com has been publishing NPI because the formula is known how to calculate it. And I think it is their plans to do the same thing for men's and women's basketball. So it could be that we have those NPI rankings from day one, courtesy of D3 Datacast, but we do not know when they will be coming in that official sense from the NCAA.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've seen through tracking it through football is just that. And obviously football, less games. So basketball is going to be a little different in that standpoint of things. But from football, we've seen a lot of fluctuations in the first few weeks. As we've gotten now into the middle part of the season and into the second half of the season, we see a lot more consistency. So I think probably similar with basketball, once we hit that point, I would think probably by the end of November, early December, by the time teams have played a handful of games, we'll start to have a little bit more consistency with the way everything is grading out. And obviously that'll continue as teams start conference play in January.
So that's NPI. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more chatter on it. But again, recommend that D3 Datacast episode as a really good place to start. And both Riley and I will be around on Twitter to answer questions as people have them. As I'm sure most people won't have questions until either games start or until the first rankings are published, whenever that happens to be. All right. So our plans for the season. We're going to start with Riley first.
Yeah, so as a lot of people know, I run the Scoop on D3 Women's Hoops newsletter on Substack. And just to make it kind of brief, I outlined this in a post not too long ago. But the plan, for this is just, again, I want to be able to cover the national scene as far as Division III women's basketball goes in the best way possible, highlight as many teams as possible in that process. And so, you can expect from me throughout the season on Mondays, all as I've done in past years, my top 25 ballot breakdown, kind of a look at my ballot, my personal ballot for the d3hoops.com top 25 poll, why I have certain teams in different places, what I'm seeing from different teams. Then throughout the rest of the week, we'll see probably more of a look at, the way results are playing out, previewing the day's games ahead, the previous day's games, and that kind of thing. But would certainly appreciate any feedback, comments on the newsletter. Want to just be able to highlight as many conferences and teams as possible, because it is 420 teams, just a lot to cover and keep up with. But I really want to be able to give credit where credit's due, to the different teams playing well around the regions. And then, as a lot of people know, I'm doing my book on Division III basketball. In the process of writing that right now, and I'm going to do my second year of research on it. Going to go to some different tournaments here in the month of November coming up, and certainly get to the East Coast a little bit more this coming year, with the goal to have the book written and hopefully published by next fall. So really excited on this. Want to highlight what makes the Division III level so special. Division III basketball have a season inside type element to the book, along with highlighting the history of these teams and programs and schools. So really looking forward to that, and certainly appreciate everyone's support through my coverage at D3 Women's Hoops.
Amazing. So for me, I will have way fewer models. So as I said, there's no real point to projecting winning percentage. No point to trying to guess how the committees are valuing criteria when constructing the regional rankings. Kind of all my Pool C guesstimation stuff. All of that is just it's not needed. So I won't be doing that. But I will be tracking newcomers. I had a lot of fun doing this last year. So once games start and some stats start being accrued, see which teams not only added new players, but are getting lots of production from those players. So early last year, I was, you could see very quickly that WashU, Chicago, and Smith all had significant contributions from players brand new to the roster. And since, Riley and I are not out here scouting high schoolers. And so while it's reasonably simple to know, like, oh, Sydney Sherman transferring to Christopher Newport will be good for them, or Kate Peak transferring to NYU will be good for them, we don't know like which freshmen are going to be significant and which ones aren't. And so once games start, you have a much better picture of that, and I can hopefully provide a decent picture nationally for teams that are getting more production from newcomers than average. And then I will definitely be thinking of ways to highlight high leverage games as we go on. I already tweeted out a stat of kind of impactful games. So looking at a team's schedule, you can see like, oh, they actually have a large weak bottom of their schedule, which if they have a small number of impactful games, they have to make those count and they have to win a high percentage of them. And so I think that there's going to be some analysis that I can do around teams' schedules. And we'll probably need to be a little bit of the way into the season first. I don't know, a third maybe. And then say, hey, these teams are fairly low in NPI and have a weak schedule. They really need to win 90% of their games. Or the flip side, they're undefeated against some great teams and they have a strong schedule. They only need to win 2/3 of them or half of them. Hopefully I can do some of that sort of analysis to give team fans an idea where their team is at. All right. Last agenda point, teams to watch and questions. So it's kind of a two-parter. A few sleepers and risers. So this is, I didn't delve too deeply here, but these are all teams that won, I believe, under 60% of their games last year, but still their opponent, they had an SOS of at least 500. So they played somewhat of a strong competition, but they also return at least 87% of their production. And so it's they kind of have the bones of they were okay last year, but didn't win a ton. But they return a lot of players and might be better this year. And I'm just going to throw them all up here. And if you have any comments on specific teams, you can hit them, Riley. But we've got Stevens, Williams, Wisconsin Lacrosse, Muhlenberg, Redlands, Edgewood, and Central in Iowa.
Yes, Guy, I think this is a great list. One of the things that I tried to do a while back for the newsletter was look at some teams that finished below 500 overall last year that have a good chance to go above 500 this year. Some of the same teams that I had on that list are here on this list as well. And I think what we see a lot with these teams generally is great amounts of returning production and quality returning production, several starters coming back and players that have a lot of experience. Williams is a team that really sticks out to me. I think they could very well be a top 25 team. You look at their record last year, they were 10-14 overall, 2-8 in the NESCAC. But they have 4 losses by single digits in conference play, 2 of them coming by a 3-point margin. They returned 4 stars that had 20 plus starts last year. Ariana Garrig, outstanding player, averaged, over 35 minutes a game last year, 21.2 points per game, 3.9 assists per game. She's an outstanding player. They have a very good core coming back, and Williams really stands out in the NESCAC for me. UW La Crosse is another interesting team, I think, because we saw them at their best last year. We also saw them go through some challenges in YI play. They had a little bit of a younger roster. They returned, 3 players that started 20 plus games last year. And they were a team I was looking at it today. They beat UW Whitewater. They beat UW Stout on the road. And when they played at Whitewater, they only lost by 7. And Whitewater was ranked highly in both times that they played. So La Crosse really matched up well with the best teams in the league throughout last season, but they just weren't quite there yet. And I think with more experience for some of those younger players, they will take that step forward this year. And the last team I would just kind of bring up, it would be Edgewood on that list because, obviously we talked about it earlier, Cole Vivian coming from Marietta. He had a ton of success there at Marietta and certainly will look to do the same at Edgewood. And he's got 4 stars coming back that all made 20 plus starts last year. They went 13-3 in their league, the NACC last year. And this is a team that knows how to win, but they haven't won on a super high level in recent years as far as competing for NCAA tournament spots and winning NCAA tournament type games. I think this is a team that could do that. And we'll see them prepared well. I mean, they play Wash U, they play Wartburg, they play Illinois Wesleyan all in that first month of the season. So I think we're going to see kind of where Edgewood's at pretty early on with those non-conference games that they play.
One fun stat about Williams that I think this is the only place you can get that stat, but Williams was the tallest team in Division III women's basketball last year. I weighted the heights of everyone on the team by minutes played, so across the whole nation too. And the average minutes weighted height for Williams, that obviously if a tall player plays more minutes, they have more impact in this calculation, was 70.8 inches. So 5'10", almost 5'11", was the average height for Williams, where most teams are rolling that out like maybe for their 2 or 3 post players, but definitely not as an average for the entire team. And actually Amherst was number 2, and I remember watching them play, I think in overtime, a pretty fun game last year.
Yeah. No, Williams will certainly be an interesting team to watch. That's a great stat.
So then kind of on the flip side, we'll look at fallers or rebuilders. So these are teams that I think won a ton, basically teams that won a ton but return very little. And we don't scout high schoolers, and so these teams might have great recruiting classes coming in. We just don't know about them. But Rhode Island College, Trinity in Connecticut, Smith, Transylvania, Marymount, and Loras all graduated lots and lots of experienced talent. And 2 of those had a coaching change, just Trinity and Transylvania.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marymount did as well. So 3 of them. Yeah, 3.
And then a couple others, DeSales, Massachusetts Dartmouth, Marietta, Hardin-Simmons, and Ohio Wesleyan are all schools that I think won at least 70% last year, but return maybe under 40% or 45%, when the average nationally is, I believe, 69%. And so, again, can't know recruiting classes, but it's just hard to replace talent.
It is, and it's hard to replace the experience. We talk all the time about that adjustment going from the high school level to the college level, And that does take time. And so I think with some of these teams that are going to be younger, especially in those first couple months of the season, we may see some fluctuation in terms of performances. Teams that come out one night and play really, really well, then the next, don't play as well. And that's just something that we may see with some of these teams. But once we get into conference play, it'll be interesting because at that point, they've had some time to develop that cohesiveness, adjust to the college game, whether that be players that didn't play a whole lot last year that are in starting roles, or high school players that, from last year that are moving up to the college level as freshmen. So that'll certainly be interesting with a lot of these teams because we know a lot of these programs have great coaching staffs and coaches who have been proven to take, younger players and develop them throughout their 4 years within the program. So something to watch for all these programs that are generally in the mix in the national conversation.
Mm-hmm. So we've got some great questions. First one from friend of the program, Matt Snyder. How do you handle preseason expectations for a team like Calvin, who returns everyone? They did not have any seniors on the roster. Their roster for this year has not been published yet. But do you expect a performance similar to the previous year because you have all the same players? Or do you expect a significant step forward for everyone and therefore the team? This was a great question, something that I had been kind of wrestling with, that I did implement something into my preseason projections to account for this. I don't know how good it was, but basically I kind of applied an adjustment saying that, hey, if you won a lot last year and against a strong SOS and you return a lot, then I would imagine that the fact that you return a lot, it means you should take an even bigger step forward. Whereas if you won 20% of your games last year against a bad strength of schedule and you return everyone, well, I don't know that you're going to now win 40% of your games. Like you might still win 20% because you weren't very good last year. And so I kind of tried to tease out where I thought that those lines were. And so an example of some adjustments. So these are all teams that won a lot last year against good competition and are returning a lot this year. So they kind of got big adjustments upwards in my preseason projections. And then kind of on the flip side, it was teams that didn't win very much last year, but still, and maybe not against the greatest strength of schedule, and return a lot of production. And they did not get a very big adjustment upwards. I think they actually got an adjustment downwards. So teams, it's kind of funny lacrosse ends up here too. I think it's just because they did win under 50% of their games. And so I'm less, if you won under, I think it is the threshold of 50% of your games. If you won under 50% of your games, that isn't a clear indication to me that just returning a lot of your players means you're going to take a big step forward. You definitely can, but I did downgrade these sorts of profiles more than I changed the profiles of the teams that I mentioned earlier. So I thought that was a great question because, just if you're bad last year and return everyone, you're probably just going to be bad again. And it could be that a team who won a similar amount to you last year but returns far less might actually end up being better because the new players were better than the players that they lost. So, and obviously I'm trying to apply formulas to all 420 teams in the same way. When each team has an incredibly different profile internally, I have to take these broad strokes. But I thought that was a great question because I do not think that teams should be treated the same. Calvin is a profile that I think should be treated with expectations of getting better because they were already a good team. And if you're a good team returning more production than another good team, I think you will relatively be better.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think you summed it up well. I think that's a good rule of thumb. I know you and I both, as top 25 voters, this is something we kind of have to think through as well when assembling our preseason top 25 ballots. And it's really something where you're trying to kind of gauge a good team returning a lot. I think generally you are going to accept that step, going to expect that step forward because a lot of times, when you return a lot, that's an additional year of collegiate experience that all those players got that now are going to carry into this next year. And, there's some situations where a team may play a weak schedule one year and play a super strong schedule the next year. And so their win percentage, ends up kind of being somewhere around the same, but they may have played better against better competition. So, there's some of those cases every year too. But I think that's a great question and well answered by you on that.
Was it the first game of the year last year that Muhlenberg beat DeSales in a defensive
Yeah, I think
battle?
so.
So
Yeah.
I mean, these are two teams that profile wise could not be more different. So DeSales won 92% of their games last year and returned 24% of their production. So almost one of the lowest in the entire nation. And Muhlenberg won 56% of their games last year. So a lot less than DeSales did, but they returned 88%. I think that, I would struggle to know which of them would I rank higher in a preseason. I think I have DeSales in the 80s, and Muhlenberg at about 70, but like reasonably, they're extremely close. I don't know who I would rank higher, but those are the sorts of profiles I think you are wrestling over. Very good
Yeah, for
question.
sure, for sure. I think we'll see some of those. I mean, you see some of those situations every year too, like especially in these leagues where, like, even if you take like Williams for example, a team that returns a lot. I could see them going from 2-8 in the NESCAC last year to now being a team that's 8-2 in the league this year. And that's an example of taking a big step forward. The record isn't always indicative necessarily of how well a team plays, but I think you also see a team like Williams, and then a team like Tufts that was on your list there a second ago. You don't know with the way recruiting goes and those kinds of things. Those two teams could end up being similar. It'll just depend on a lot of variables that we don't even know right now. So yeah.
Right. And our other question from friend of the program, Logan Hansen. In the last couple of seasons, have teams with a heavy fifth-year rotation, like Wartburg, fared better than expectations? And how do those teams usually do after graduating? So I'm guessing he was going for so many of those career minutes. So I don't know if you were hoping for an extremely statistical analysis. I couldn't really think of a good way to do that because I just don't have the historical data. But I did look at the count of fifth-year players or graduate players on last year's rosters. I might have lost some of this information, so these numbers are sure to be somewhat inaccurate. But I had 7 for St. Scholastica, and then less from there. But I think what matters most is not just that you have grad years, but that they are good. And so like some teams that I'll highlight, Pacific had 4, Transylvania had 3, Bowdoin had 2, Ithaca with 2, NYU with 2. Warburg I only had with 1, which feels low. I feel like that they had more fifth years last year. But in any case, just having fifth years does not mean that you will have a big rise as a program. They need to be good players. But I think it's undeniable that if you have a good player that's back for their fifth year, especially if it's with the same program, that it's going to help your team tons. But then one thing that I think is also undeniable is that because there's a finite number of minutes available to play each year, if you have a grad year, and especially multiple grad players, it really disrupts kind of a natural flow of the freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, where I've really seen teams like Christopher Newport and Hope who play an up-tempo style and play a lot of players as a result. Their development really benefits from that because they're playing like players 8 to 12 on the roster might still be averaging 8 or 9 minutes a game, whereas on other rosters they're almost not playing. And so when if those players have been playing 8 or 9 minutes a game when they're freshmen and sophomores, maybe by juniors they're starting, they have so much more experience under their belt. But if you have a grad year, kind of this disruption from COVID, it can disrupt that. Now, in the short term, you're going to want those grad years. You want those players as long as you can, but they are not a fault of their own. They are stealing developmental minutes from other players on the roster because there's a finite number of minutes. And so one thing that I did track for Hope is number of career minutes returning to the roster. So it's minutes played in their entire career when they return. And it's fascinating to me where 2020, they were undefeated when the season got canceled because of COVID. They were 29-0. They were a great team with great players. They didn't have a crazy number of career minutes. But then in 2021, were they fifth years there? No. I think I have this right. But in 2021 was when they went 16-0. So they had an unusually large crop of seniors that had all kind of moved through the system together. So I don't think 2021 was an artificial year as far as the roster. But you can see, like, yeah, they just happened to have tons of career experience there. And then when they were national champions, they had a bunch of fifth years. So just crazy amounts of experience and quality on the roster. 2023, they still had one fifth year, which kind of kept that number higher. But then last year, they had the lowest number of returning career minutes that they'd had since 2012, over a decade. And so, like, it was just kind of, it had to happen where if you had all those fifth years, they were taking up minutes and they were taking them from somewhere. And it doesn't mean that the year after you're going to experience a big downturn in talent or winning, but at some point it is kind of going to hit.
Right.
And I think this illustrates it where you see kind of a random fluctuation between 2012 and 2020, because sometimes you have better recruiting classes, sometimes you have worse, sometimes players transfer, sometimes they don't. But then 2021 and 2022 were artificially high, specifically because of COVID and the fifth year waiver. And then it kind of cratered in 2024 because of coming off the flip side of that. Because, I mean, if you averaged this across, every year, like, the average should be the same.
Yeah.
Right. Because everyone's playing the same number of minutes. And actually, one tweak on this is I do think I normalized this to number of games so that a team that played 30 games in a year and a team that played 25, I did some amount of normalization there. But I think the point still stands where artificially high amounts of returning experience that at some point cratered. So I don't think it's any statistical like craziness, Logan. But fifth years, you want to have good fifth years. But I mean, unless you're a top 5 team and can really take liberties to develop your younger players during the regular season, unless you're that sort of elite team, you can't really afford to be risking losses by playing an unusually large rotation. So you kind of just have to roll with it. I definitely have been looking into rosters that are either balanced or imbalanced when it comes to players across the classes, because I mean, there's one school that has 6 seniors, 0 juniors, 6 sophomores, 1 freshman. And I just wonder. I imagine this happens just randomly. No one's trying to become imbalanced like that. I also wonder how much effort would it take, and is it worth it to never have that level of imbalance? I imagine you probably don't want to take those steps, because why would you not keep a player on the roster who would be a contributor just because they're a year that you're imbalanced towards?
Right.
But I think those sorts of dynamics are really interesting as a coach when you're recruiting, developing players, deciding how many minutes to play. Really, really interesting dynamics there that I just don't have very much knowledge about.
Yeah, and obviously I'm not a coach either. But what I have heard is, you get into some of these situations too, where a team that is going to be, senior laden in a couple of years, if you can kind of look ahead, into the next 2, maybe 1 to 2 years, and you throw in the fifth years as well, recently for a lot of these programs, recruits can look at that and say, well, they're going to have 6 or 7 seniors, fifth years combined, and playing time is going to be very limited early on. And that's a tough thing as far as recruiting goes. And that's something that coaches have tried, to do, in different ways. And some programs I think have done better with it than others, but it's just a challenge sometimes because you do have these situations where the rotation is going to be pretty much comprised of the seniors and the fifth year seniors for even if it's just the future season. And that can make recruiting a little bit hard because playing time is going to be, less available for those players coming in. And I think that's how you can sometimes get to some of these programs that only have one or two, freshmen, sophomores coming in the year. And I think, you can get imbalanced that way. And we'll certainly see it. I think once the fifth year goes away, as we talked about, it should balance out a little bit more, but not, the way recruiting classes go. Sometimes, underclassmen leave the program before they're seniors, and you can get unbalanced that way too. So there's a lot that goes on year to year with these rosters that creates situations like that where you have an influx of seniors or a higher amount of seniors or juniors and fewer sophomores and freshmen to kind of lead the way 2, 3, 4 years down the road.
Right. It's not like coaches have their pick and they're just going to say, I'm going to recruit one post, one wing, and two guards every single year, and everyone's going to stay for 4 years.
That's a position.
That's not,
yeah.
That's not how it works.
Yeah, because and the coaches are trying to recruit to positions. If they have a player that's a freshman that they can tell is probably gonna be a 4-year starter, and they're trying to balance that out. Like, they're trying to recruit specific positions as well. And I don't know to what degree every program goes into that. I know some programs, try to hit a certain number on their roster every year, but yeah, there's a lot that goes on with that, and it's not a perfect science at all, and certainly takes time. Sometimes rosters just turn out the way they do.
Yeah. So my last agenda item is my way too early top 30. So this is going to match what's on my website. And I'm calling that, well, it is objective, but that doesn't mean it's good. It just means that I'm not manually moving teams up and down a spot here or a spot there. I'm factoring in their winning percentage, SOS, and NPI of last year. Players, what percentage of their production that they are returning this year, and I am adjusting for known transfers into the program. And then that one adjustment that we talked about based off of, hey, if you were bad and returned everyone, you might still be bad. So all those kind of go together. I'm not going to read every team or go through all of them. But I found it interesting that Johns Hopkins and Gettysburg are very, very high because both of those teams won well over 80% of the games last year and returned close to everybody. DePauw high was really interesting to me. WashU might surprise some people because I think they won 680, 68% of their games last year. But if you look at their losses, I don't think there's a single bad loss among them. Most of those losses were to very good teams, and most of them were very close in margin. So I think WashU could have a large leap in winning percentage, even if the difference in team quality, I think is, I think they were high quality last year, and I think they're going to be high quality again this year. Gustavus Adolphus hanging around there as they have a bunch of fifth years returning. Chatham, we talked about Chatham with a lot of transfers coming in. Denison might surprise some people. That's also a very tall team. But kind of Chatham, Washington, Lee, and Denison right in a row are a good microcosm of regions 6 and 7 being really, really strong. Those regions were quite young last year and returned lots of production among the best teams in those regions. SUNY New Paltz, another team that returns just almost an entire starting lineup of fifth years. That will be an interesting data point, but maybe not surprising. Middlebury, another one kind of similar to WashU that had a lot of close losses against good teams, but I think the talent level was strong. Catholic has at least one or two key fifth years returning. Vassar had a bunch of juniors last year, so they're senior laden, but not grad year laden. Dickinson's keeping Region 5 strong. There's Calvin. We talked about Calvin. Baldwin Wallace, another Region 7. Randolph Macon, another Region 6. Hope, another Region 7. And Berea, I believe, is Region 8 now, right? Being in the HCAC with Transylvania and Mount St. Joseph and Hanover. So this is kind of my way too early top 30. I think there might be some surprises there for people. I think Denison, Chatham, maybe DePaul and WashU as high as they are there. But I imagine I'm pretty confident that these are going to be among your top, 30, 35 teams this year. Any surprises to you, Riley, or teams that you think are missing in a surprising way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, DePaul being as high as they are, but, some of this, I think, like you said, you can understand it when you actually go back and look at, their performance in the previous season, who they're bringing back. I think WashU is going to be really, really good. I don't know exactly where I'm going to have them on my preseason ballot, but I could definitely see them in my top 10. Denison is an interesting one. I really think they could be kind of an under the radar team this year. Because they are going to be very, very talented. I think UW Oshkosh is going to be a lot higher for me. But again, what you're calculating and the way I'm kind of putting together my thing, they're different. In terms of the way we put them together, what you have right here, based a lot on the numbers and the returning productions and all those factors. I think a lot of it really makes sense when we look at it. And a lot of, I think Region 6 is going to be really interesting to follow this year because there are a lot of teams in there. Even a team like Emory, who I think is going to be really, really good this year. You have the ODAC, obviously Christopher Newport in the Coast to Coast Conference. There's going to be a lot of really good teams out of Region 6. Washington Lee, stands out there at number 15. So I think it's a great top 30. And I think you're right. It's you can certainly look through here and see some of the regions that are looking to be stronger this year as we head into the season. I think that's going to be interesting for people to watch the way these regions play out and some of these teams that we haven't necessarily seen in the top 25, top 30 discussion. Even like a Middlebury, who I think has been very good for a few years now and could really take a big step forward this year. So, great top 30. I really like it.
I believe both Riley and I will be top 25 voters again for D3hoops.com. And I know that there's a handful of teams here that were elite last year, but return less than 70% of their production. The 5 up top are NYU, Wisconsin Whitewater, Christopher Newport, Bowdoin, and Bates. And so when I am putting together my preseason top 25 ballot, I'll really be looking at those rosters and seeing if any of their returning stars, maybe they spread around minutes a lot last year because of how strong the teams were, that they can spread the minutes around less and not really have as big of a fallback as a lower amount of returning production might indicate. And so I think NYU with Bruns might be that case. I don't know what Bruns's workload was last year, but it seems reasonable that it will be higher this year without Morrison. And that fact alone could mean almost no step back for NYU, right? When you're like, oh, I added 150 or 200 minutes of Natalie Bruns to my team. That's amazing. So like that's definitely a dynamic that right now is not captured. It's just, oh, Johns Hopkins returns 93% of their production and NYU returns 62%. That's a very big difference.
Right.
When their winning percentage was only, undefeated to 889. But I'll definitely be digging into some of those workloads, and it just, that's a really good picture of why top 25 voting is fun, because if it was just a computer formula like this, it's not really fun.
Right.
You can look at my list and you can be like, oh, why is Chatham so high? And then I can tell you, and then maybe we can talk about, oh, I wouldn't value that piece of data as highly as you would. But I don't know. I think it's a lot more fun to talk about the qualitative differences, or just kind of the differences in valuation philosophy when you pick teams rather than difference in computer valuation.
Right. Right. And I was just going to say too, like the Centennial Conference, like I don't know that I will have Johns Hopkins and Gettysburg at 1 and 3, but I could definitely see both in the top 10, whether it be in the preseason or at some point early on the year. You also have Dickinson there at 25. Like the Centennial Conference is going to be very, very good. I think it could be one of the top conferences in the country this year because of those top 3. Certainly seems likely that they'll get 3 into the tournament. I don't know how that's all going to work out with the numbers, and there's going to be a lot that has to happen and non-conference schedules and whatnot. But the Centennial Conference is going to be very, very good this year. And, that's something to keep an eye on too. Like, Johns Hopkins and Gettysburg, we could see them both in the top 10 because of how much they return. And I think when I'm putting together my preseason ballot, you go based on what you saw last year, but you also go, I think, based for me at least on who they're returning and the quality of those. And I think you bring up a good point with, are they bringing back players like Bowdoin, I believe has Sidney Jones back, and players like that they can kind of build around. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to look at as far as, the season goes and putting together our preseason ballots.
Yep. Bowdoin has not published a roster yet, but Sidney Jones was listed as a junior last year, so assuming that she is returning. Yeah, definitely. If you have a player of that quality, even losing a couple players around them can mean you're not expecting as large of a drop off.
Yeah, WNL is another example with Schleissner. Obviously Malik leaving, but Schleissner's back. They're going to have pieces also around her, but when you have a player like that, it can really keep you in the conversation, and keep you in contention within the league. Like the ODAC is going to be tough. WNL's going to have some serious competition, but I think they have a roster and with the talent in their starting five to really not only compete at a high level within the ODAC, but also on a national scale and maybe even duplicate what they did last year in the tournament.
Yeah, they'll be a fascinating team to watch because I think Malik did a lot for them to run the team. And looking at their roster right now, the 2 juniors from last year that are going to be seniors this year, and they are returning, didn't play tons of minutes, 340 and 230 minutes. So it'll be interesting to see if they look like a similar team or if they look like a much different team without Malik, who, I think she did everything. She was kind of I think the term glue player can be used for a player that doesn't have elite talent, but she both had elite talent and was a glue player.
Right.
And so those players can be extremely, extremely hard to replace. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I can't really remember how much she impacted the game in the tournament because Schleissner was scoring all the time, but you need someone getting the ball to her, running the team, getting the ball at the court.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, all right. So that runs it to a close. Looks like we did not get any additional questions during the live stream. But I don't know when we have plans for another one of these. Riley, we're probably going to feel out the beginning of the year and see if there are any NPI developments. And maybe we do another one sometime around the holidays or sometime around the new year. But we're probably going to be on a similar cadence to last year where I think we did 3 or 4 over the course of the season.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, once we have a chance to see how non-conference play is going and how NPI is, kind of in some ways responding to what the results we're seeing, I think it would be a good time as we get towards, the holidays and season's already a little bit underway to start looking at some things, talking about some of the things that we've seen. I know we'll both probably be on Hoopsville at some point. Not sure when that'll be, but you'll see us throughout the year on X, kind of giving our analysis and thoughts and things. So but I think as far as live streams go, we'll be back here again at some point during the season. I think we can say that with some certainty. Before we get to the tournament, we'll be on here at least once more, if not twice.
Excellent. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us who joined us live. Thanks to anyone who happens to watch this back in the future. And we can't wait for the season to begin and have more of these live streams. Thanks, everyone.